Okay, so we are back in studio again, and I have my implementation of the performer open, and it's called ACM performer process, and it has already been deployed to the orchestrator, as you can see from the assistant here. Just as we discussed the UiPath stock implementation, we will go back a few steps and start from where we left off in the last session, right? In the last session, we had actually run the dispatcher process and we had ingested a few files, right? And we'll start off from there and see how the implementation of the performer is aligned with that, right? So in the last part of the previous episode where we discussed the dispatcher, we ran a demo of the dispatcher process, and that process ingested a few files. And after it ingested the files, it added them to the queue and also deposited those files in a predefined location on the robot machine, right? So if the process that you saw is the ACM dispatcher process, and then if you recall, this is the queue into which it deposited a few queue items. So we're going to view transactions. You'll see that there are 3 items. And since it was run during the last session, these items are still sitting in the queue. They have not been processed yet. And like I said, my implementation of the dispatcher was pretty lightweight, and it did not do the heavy lifting that you saw in adding items to the queue as a very complex dictionary, right? It did not do that. Rather, what it did was it accepted the file, it saw where the file was located, and then it deposited the location of that file as the file name attribute of this queue item, right? So there are 3 example files that are taken. And if I take the path of this file from this queue item and go into my file folders, you will see that those files were deposited at the accepted location, right? So if I copy this here, you will see that that file is available at this location, right? So when my performer runs, what it's going to do is it knows the queue items are to be processed. It will retrieve this queue item. It will fetch the file path from here, from the queue item, because there is this file name attribute. And then it will go into this location and pull this file in to be processed, right? And once that happens, once that file has been read, the ACM data library that I have implemented kicks in, and we can see how that library is used in my performer process in a series of actions that I have composed in a way that you can easily follow, right? So with that, what I'll do is I'll go into the performer process, and I'm going to dive straight into the process flow. So what happens here? Again, this is pretty standard. Like I said, the processor, the ACM performer process will run. It will load the queue item. It will read the queue item from the queue, right? The get transaction item is of type queue item, and that is handed off to the process stage. And then when it hits the process stage, it is going to retrieve the current file path. You can see that the current file path is retrieved from this file name specific content that is stored in my queue item, and it's called file name, right? So good. Now, there is something that I did not go into too much detail when I implemented the dispatcher. There is another way where you can store this file. You don't have to keep it on your disk. Instead, you can put it in your storage bucket, right? And here you can see that there is another specific queue item that talks about the storage bucket path, right? So that is also part of this queue item. And here is the name of that storage bucket item. And if I go back into my storage bucket for this folder, there is something called ACM data file storage bucket. And that entire Excel file is stored here, right? You can do this as well. You don't have to keep it on a physical robot machine, right? So this is slightly different from doing this. So instead of doing all the fancy JSON, you can simply read the file from the storage bucket because you know the path to the file in the storage bucket, and it will be like reading an Excel file, right? So you have the complexity of keeping all your data in the cloud without having to keep it in on a physical file disk location on the robot machine, with the simplicity of reading the Excel. And once it does that, it starts the process of loading the current file, right? So now that it knows that it has the file, it is not simply enough that it has the current file path. It performs a check to see if that file is existing. If the file exists, that means you can proceed with loading the data, right? So this is where the action starts. If the file exists, you go into the happy path, which is the true path, and here you now read the information about the file. You read the data from the current file and you put it into current file data table object, right? And then for each row in that file, you perform the load sequence, right? You load that record into data service. And here is the set of actions that you see under another flow that is called QOps load record to data service. And if I open that, you will now see all the actions that are being performed to load that single record into your data service entity. So the input to this flow will be your current row from the current file. Let us say I open state code 5. So this is the current row representation. And all the actions that you're now going to see will run within the context of this current row, okay? If I go back to the performer process and open this flow, so the first thing that you might want to look at is this comment here, and it says that the site location master records must follow a specific order, right? And the order has been listed here: state, county, and site. These three records have to exist in a specific order or must be created in a specific order before you can move to create the ACM concentration data, which is the core data that you want to create, right? And therefore, we start with state because state is the root reference. We have to create the state, and if the state exists, then we can use that state information to create the county record. And then once the county exists, you can use the county and state to create the site record. And therefore, you have to follow a specific order to create these three master entities, right? So now that you've got that, you are now going to begin the process of creating all the master records, master entity records that are required for this entire record to be created in data service, right? And you can see that I've numbered them in the order. So you start with ACM state master record, you start with ACM county master record, and then you create the site master record, right? So let us start with the ACM state master. First, I call the get master state information action of my library, right? And I give it the state code and I give it the state name. And if the state code and state name already exist, then a valid state record object is returned, right? So if I go in here and look at this entity diagram, if the state code and the state name already exists, then a valid state ACM state entity with that ID is returned, right? So next, I make sure to check if that state record information already exists. This is very similar to what we saw in the stock implementation of the solution accelerator template library, right? If the master record already exists, then that's great. You just put it in the log and you know that the state record is already existing and no more action is required. Now, if it is not existing, you'll have to create it, right? And therefore, here we log a line saying, okay, the state information was not found, and I'm going to create one. And that is where we call the state transformation action. Remember what I had said. I did not see the calls to the energy transformation action in the stock implementation. So this is where I've implemented it. So basically what the transformation does is it takes the raw data, it takes the attributes of the data and transforms it into a state, ACM state object, right? So I pass in the current row, and then what I get back is an ACM state record of type ACM state, right? And then once I have that object, I can now create it. So I call the create ACM state record action. So raw data gets transformed to an object, and that object is now used to create a record in the backend data service entity, right? So here you have create ACM state data record. Once that is complete, you know that the new ACM state record has been created, and we write that line to the log file. So this is good. At this point, you have created the ACM state record, and you know that this data, state code 5, and the state name related to that is already existing in your data service entity. Next comes the county. We go to step number 2, right? So again, everything is organized here. I have numbered these steps. I have to create the ACM county record. Again, I run a check for it. I do the transformation, and then I create the ACM county data record, right? Now, how do I know that the county record will get created? Well, I know that because I have created the state associated with that already in the previous step. Now, if this step had failed, your exception would stop right there. Your process would stop right there. And if the ACM state, county, and site records are not created, you cannot create this entity record. So the entire process fails, right? This queue item processing will fail. And therefore, if this item is, or this action is successful, then your county record would be created without any problems. So here you do the county transformation, and then you create the county data record. I think you've got an idea of what happens when we create the site, right? I go to the site. Again, I do the same thing. Because I have the state and county information, site record gets created. So I do the transformation, and I do the create the site data record. And by the time I am at the end of step 3, I'm already here, right? I have followed that specific order. Next, we start going into the independent master records of your actual data record, right? So if I go back to my entity diagram, you will see that all these items that I have marked in dark shade here, right? This color here, they are all independent master entities that are required before the concentration data can be created in my data service. Obviously, there is no specific order in which you can check for them, because they don't have to be in a specific order. You can check in any order you want. And therefore, what we do is we do something similar to what we did with site, state, county, and site, but we don't do it in any specific order, right? So at step 4, I start the actions or call the library actions to create each of these master records, right? The first one is UOM. And here you can see I do the transformation of the data into an object of type ACM UOM. And then I create that record, success. The next would be the duration. You will see that every step is almost identical to the previous one. The only difference is you're dealing with a different entity object in each step. And here is duration. And as we keep traversing down, this is POC. Again, everything is the same. If you get it right for one, then chances are when you repeat this process for the others, you will get everything right. So if I go down to all steps. I have step 7, 8, 9, 10. You see, I have created all those 7 or 8 master entities that you see in this color here in my backend data service. And once I know that all the master entities are created, the last thing that is left for me to do, or the last but one thing that is left for me to do, is to create the data information record, right? So here I create that data information record, which is this record here. Obviously, in this case, the entity is EPA, right? Environmental Protection Agency. So before I create this data information record, you will see that I need to have site, I need to have county, and I need to have state, right? Because each site is distinct by these attributes. And therefore, that record that comes in has to be related by a unique identification ID, or what is called as ACM data information ID, which identifies that EPS site at that location. And that location is a combination of the state, the county, and the site, right? So I go about creating the ACM data information record, and obviously the state information, the county information, and the site information is already available because we have created it upstream, and I create that record, right? So if I try in here, I create that record. This is great. And once I do that, the last step, step number 12, is where I create this ACM concentration data record. By this time, I have everything I need to create this record, right? So the last step would be to create ACM concentration data record object. Once this load record to data service flow completes, your data record must be created in your backend data service. So this record must be created in your backend data service. So before I step into the demo, I just want to quickly cover a few things that you might want to observe in this performer process implementation, right? The first thing is that you have the ACM data collection reusables added to this project, right? It is required. Generic reusables is again a standard library to perform those standard templated actions. The performer process can use this library. And another thing that you can also see is that the ACM data collection reusables also uses the generic reusable library inside of it to perform those standard templated actions, right? So if I go back into activities, and if I go into generic, through the generic reusables library, you have access to all of these standard library actions that the performer can do. For example, if you want to run a regular expressions check, you can use this method from the generic reusables library. The second important thing to note, right, going back to the project, is there are no entity references in the performer process. There are no entity references here because the library, the data collection reusables library, abstracts the detail of the data service away from the performer. The performer has got no first-hand information about the backend data service entity, right? And therefore, if I go into activities and if I do ACM, if I say ACM, you will see that it has access to this performer process, rather has access to all the actions related to data transformation, file operations, and master record operations and record operations. All these methods you will see have been called in the load record to data service flow, right? So the performer process has no first-hand knowledge of the data service, right? And that is why you do not see those entity objects. How do I create those entity objects then, right? What are the objects that I need to work with if I have to create, let us say, ACM currency or ACM site? So how do I get to those objects, right? So if I go into project, let me quickly create a flow. I'm going to say new. And I'm going to go down to arguments. I'm going to create a new argument. Let me say an ACM state or object. You can name it anything. I'm just giving an example. So I go in, argument type. I go in, I say browse for types, and I look for ACM again. And here you can see the references to data service .acm data collection reusables. And here you can see all those objects. You will see ACM state, ACM site. So these are the object types that you need to work with, because that library gives you references to these objects. So I want to create an ACM state object. I select this object and I have reference to that object, right? So this is how the performer process creates records in data service while at the same time having no idea or first-hand information about what that data source is. Tomorrow, that data source might change from data service entities to a SQL database, to an Oracle database. As long as the library abstracts that information away from performer process, the performer process is not directly working with the data service entity or the backend data source anywhere in this performer process implementation. So that is something that you might want to take note of, which forms kind of a very important understanding of the concepts that have been discussed in detail in the documentation that comes with that solution accelerator template, right? And I covered those documentation details in the very first or second part of the solution accelerator series. All right, it is time for a demo. And like I said, the last time I loaded these files through the dispatcher process into into the queue, and we are going to follow up by running the performer process. So if everything works well, then these three files must be consumed, and we should see data for state code 5, state code 30, and state code 80 being created in our data service entity. And as you can see, a long time ago, I had created, a couple of test records here. And after I run the performer process, we should see some more records being created. So with that, I'm going to start the demo of the performer process. And as you can see, the files are being processed, and as each file is being processed from the accepted folder, it's being loaded, and then it's either being put into a processed folder or a rejected folder, right? And as you can see in the job logs, you see detailed information about these entity records being created, logged. And here we have it with it's about 2 minutes. Those files have disappeared from the accepted folder. If I go up one level, if I go into success, and here they are, state code 5, state code 80, and state code 30. These three files have all been successfully loaded. The job has ended successfully. And if I now bring out the orchestrator and look at the logs, I refresh them, it says that success emails were sent, right? And if I go back to data service and refresh ACM state, you will find that it has created 3 records for state ID 30, state ID 5, and state ID 80, right? And then if I go into entities and go into county and go into data, right? And here you can see the country of Mexico, Arkansas, Montana in state code 85 and 30 respectively. And then I go to the site. If I go to ACM site, I go into the data. Likewise, it will show that a local site name for state code 80. You can see that this is from the county of Mexico, and this is from the state code 5. It's from Hot Springs from state code 5. And then we have state code 30. The site name is Great Falls Overlook Park, right? And if we keep going, we can see that each of the data for all of these, all of the records coming in for these 3 states would have been created. And we go to the last entity, which is the ACM concentration data, which is this that entity, the last entity where all of the data measurements are kept. And if I go in here, you can see all the data has been recorded for those 3 states. And if we cross-check between this file, between the file that came in and also the data points, we will be able to verify that this is, of course, the data that came in just now. And just for completeness, I'm going to open up the Excel file and compare, one or two spot check, 1 or 2 items to make sure that it has indeed done its work correctly. So I'm going to open up state code 5. Let us take a look at method name, right? It's a pretty prominent name. And if I go back and check the record, here it is, RNP model 2000 PM 2-5. That's the method name that's been created. And you can find, you can see that this is indeed that record. And the year is 2023. And any other data points that we can verify. Let's look at the 99th percentile, for example, because the numbers have to be accurate. Here it is, 99th percentile, 98th percentile, and 95. Let's see, they all look identical as 24. Here it is, all of them are 24, 24, 24, and 24. And if I scroll to the left and do some more spot checking, let us see if there is something different. Okay, let us see valid day count and required day count. Let's scroll to the left. There it is, valid day count is 31, required day count is 61. So I guess that this proves the point. So to conclude this series, I wanted to go through a quick recap of the entire Solution Accelerator series. As you know, we started with downloading the template, and then we went through the documentation. And after going through the documentation and understanding the documentation, I went about taking data from EPA, right, which looked almost related, and created this entity diagram, right? We created all these entities, understood the relationship, formed those relationships, and then we went into the data service. We created all the data, the data service entities. We created the choice sets that we require. We established all of that, and then we stepped into the implementation of the dispatch of the data service library. And in the data service library, we implemented all of the actions that are required for us to load the master entities, transform these entities, and also finally load the concentration data measurement information into the backend data service. So once we implemented the library, we then stepped into the first moving part of the solution accelerator, and that is the dispatcher. So in the dispatcher, we saw how the data is being pulled from the physical Excel files and then being loaded, into queues. And then we followed that up with today's session, the second moving part, the performer process. And we saw that in action. We saw the performer picking up from where the dispatcher left off and then loading the data from those files into the backend data service. And just to prove that everything was being done correctly, we did a spot check of all the data points that were supposed to be loaded, and we found that we did not see any any exceptions. So that is all for this video and this video series. I hope if you have stayed with me up to this point, then congratulations. I hope that you have learned a lot, and I hope you learned something new. And if you did, please do like and subscribe to this channel. I'll truly appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.